listening. She promised that I would use that word someday. That is a state in which its energy remains untapped. With the district and its partners and WEC and funding partners deeply engaged in the work to foster a robust foster a robust ecosystem. Each month, the Worcester Education Collaborative convenes the Worcester Education Equity Roundtable, a gathering of partners with a dog in the hunt, so to speak, for shared learning, issue spotting, and joint action. The range of participants: higher education, the Worcester Public Schools, youth development agencies, parent groups, members of the legislature, and others. Each brings a distinct perspective and expertise that is shared and, in that context, amplified. The changes at hand are leading us to the right direction and positioning us well to address emerging issues. And there are several at hand that will require our shared response to address effectively. Literacy and reading achievement continues to keep many of us up at night. Before the pandemic, the percentage of children unable to read at grade level by the end of grade 3 hovered around 63%. As a result of the disruption, our kids have lost considerable ground. And now that number of kids struggling to read stands at 73%. This is absolutely unacceptable. This is unconscionable. Reading with proficiency is the foundation of all academic learning. Those unable to do so are compromised in their ability to access the math curriculum, the science curriculum, the history and social studies curriculum. As a colleague once said, having kids unable to read is like sending guests to the buffet without a plate and without utensils. And without mastering this skill, not only are kids' futures compromised, but so is the quality of our common life. And now this is the part where I start to shout. Several months ago, I was driving through one of our state's wealthier communities when I passed by a building that I thought was an independent school. It was not. Swankarama, actually, up to date with a deep learning infrastructure. It was a source of pride for kids and the city. My hair caught on fire as I thought about Grafton Street School, Burncoat High School, East Middle School, places with faculty as committed to leading edge teaching, students as eager and as urgent a need for 21st learning tools as any other community in our city, in our state. Flashing red before my eyes was the question: how is this equity? How can we, as a commonwealth, allow this to happen? WEC has already begun addressing this outrage. We convened a huddle in the spring with the district, the municipality, the state school building authority, and our legislative delegation to come to a shared understanding of the issues bearing on this problem. We have commissioned a study to delve deeper into the matter and to identify possible solutions. We are working with sister organizations in the state to develop a plan of action and of advocacy. This is WEC in its role as catalyst, as convener, and as champion of our kids and their education. Worcester is a city with all of the elements needed to create an exemplary system of schools. We have a generous philanthropic community. We have a strong nonprofit sector. We have a burgeoning creative and cultural sphere, leading edge businesses, and a population that represents our increasingly plural nation. As I noted at the beginning of my remarks, we are at a once-in-a-generation inflection point to improve and support teaching and learning in our city and to assure a sound future for our kids and for our home. Let's continue to capture this moment and to capture what is possible. Thank you. Let me now introduce the Director of Grant Making for the Nellie Mae Education Foundation, Marcos Lucio Popovich. And I do want to note that the Nellie Mae Foundation has been a strong partner among our many other partners who are listed in the work of WEC and working with us to advance our mission and our hopes for our community. So thank you, Marcos.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, good afternoon. And I just want to say on behalf of the Nellie Mae Education Foundation, I want to thank the Worcester Education Collaborative for all that it's doing for the students of Worcester. I want to thank Jen Carey and her staff. Thank you so, so much. Let's give it a big round of applause for the Worcester Education Collaborative. Nellie Mae is a regional foundation. We're based in Quincy, Massachusetts, where we serve New England. We're a foundation that is committed to championing efforts to prioritize goals that challenge racial inequities and advance excellent student-centered public education for all New England youth. Today, I have the distinct honor of introducing the Bassett Symposium panelists. Today, our moderator this afternoon is Secretary Paul Reville. He is the Francis Keppel Professor of Practice of Educational Policy and Administration at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Secretary Reville is the founding director of Harvard's Education Redesign Lab. His career has combined research, policy, and practice. For nearly 5 years, Secretary Reville served as the Secretary of Education for the Commonwealth. As Governor Patrick's top education advisor, Secretary Reville established a new Executive Office of Education and had oversight of higher education, K-12, and early education in the nation's leading student achievement state. He served in the governor's cabinet and played a leading education reform role on matters ranging from the Achievement Gap Act of 2010 and Common Core state standards to the Commonwealth's highly successful Race to the Top proposal. Prior to joining the Patrick administration, Secretary Reville chaired the Massachusetts State Board of Education, founded the Rennie Center, and co-founded the Massachusetts Business Alliance for Education. He holds a BA from Colorado College, an MA from Stanford University, and 5 honorary doctorate degrees. Next, joining us as a panelist, we have Dr. Rachel Monárrez, the Superintendent of Worcester Public Schools. She is entering her 3rd decade working in education. Dr. Monárrez holds a vast knowledge base for academic excellence, professional development, and collaborative practice. She has done it all in various California school systems prior to coming to Worcester. She has served as a teacher, school principal, director of English learner programs and special education, assistant superintendent, and deputy superintendent. Dr. Monárrez is a social justice champion and works collaboratively with all stakeholders to foster a culture of equity, academic excellence, and high expectations for all learners. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in History from the University of California, Irvine, and a Master's of Arts in Education and a PhD with an emphasis on urban education from Claremont Graduate University. And finally, joining us as a panelist, we have Dr. Gisele Shorter, President and CEO of the Nellie Mae Education Foundation. Foundational to Dr. Shorter's career is the deep belief that an equitable society starts with an equitable education system. Over the last 15 years, she has led large-scale community-based programs, research and policy initiatives to advance justice and equity, to close health disparities and ensure access and opportunities for Black and Brown youth and communities to flourish. Prior to joining Nellie Mae, Dr. Shorter served as the director of the National Education Strategy at the Rakes Foundation. She is a distinguished senior fellow at the Office of Leadership and Innovation at NYU Steinhardt Department of Administration, Leadership and Technology. Dr. Shorter holds a doctorate in education from the Teachers College, Columbia University, a master's degree from Long Island University, and a bachelor's degree from Amherst College. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me in welcoming Dr. Shorter, Dr. Monárrez, and Secretary Reville.
I'll sit on the side so you can see. Thank you. Okay, we've got to get our microphones adjusted here. For me, it's a treat to be back in Worcester. I don't generally like long bios when they're doing intros, but the one thing that was left out that I have to add was I founded the Alliance for Education along with a number of other people here. And I say that because I see a number of friends in the audience who probably don't recognize me due to the process of aging, and I may not recognize you, but I'm so thrilled and happy to be here and really proud of the work that WEC does and carrying on the traditions that we started with this sort of gathering the ecosystem to support public education way back in the mid-1980s. So congratulations to Jen. Thank you for inviting me to this. And I'm thrilled to be here, and we have a wonderful panel. We're going to lift the next generation in this community, so we appreciate that very much. So the opening question I'd like to ask each of our panelists is, tell us a little bit about your why, about what influenced you to take the leadership positions you've taken. This is a challenging time for leaders in the education ecosystem. You've both stepped up to take on demanding leadership opportunities, and what went into your thinking and motivated you to embrace the challenge? Gisele, you want to start?
So my why starts well before COVID, well before I entered philanthropy. And it really starts with a set of decisions that my mother made. I'm born and raised in Spanish Harlem, El Barrio. Historically, when you look at census tracts in this country, you can almost profile children, their educational outcomes, their life outcomes, their health outcomes. My mother particularly made a set of choices and sacrifice to send me to schools outside of my community. That set the pace for a logical set of academic outcomes, opportunities, access, and afforded me opportunities that my brother did not have. My brother that is 7 years older than me, far smarter than I am, but wasn't perceived as user-friendly, right? And so I am clear that I should not forever be advantaged because I had an opportunity to lead my community. And so for 20 plus years, I have been in service of young people that have been least well served by our youth serving systems, particularly multi-system involved young people. And so at the top of COVID, I was really chafing, right? And having this kind of existential crisis. What does this moment call me into? I was no longer in direct service. I felt like I was hiding in some ways. Philanthropy is, by design, a very decadent experience. And I thought, okay, how do I punch harder? What am I called in to do? And what's the coverage that I can afford state chiefs, superintendents, and others, particularly at the top of 21, when I was hearing from many of my national partners that there was a growing drumbeat asking folks to not keep their eyes on those young people, those children that were most impacted by COVID, but to focus on a subset of children, right? And we were battling about bathroom wars, and we were starting to battle out about masks, right? Many of the things that were taking us away from the urgent needs that our young people and that our workforce needed us to keep our eyes on. And so I kind of doubled down on what I could get done in philanthropy as one of the most disruptive forces in our country, but a force that can be leveraged for good. And so that's why Nellie Mae, they're unapologetic about advancing education justice
Mhm.
And so education justice to me means raising the quality of education for every child across New England, regardless of socioeconomic status, regardless of country of origin or birth, regardless to identity, right? What do we as adults and stewards of systems commit to providing and ensuring for every child?
All means all.
All means all.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. We're going to touch on a number of the challenges that you raised in that. But Rachel, how about you? Not only you embraced the challenge, but you came 3,000 miles to do it.
Yeah. Well, we all know it was because of the weather.
Yeah, exactly.
So why Worcester, right? First of all, I didn't even know how to say it. I still don't say it correctly. I know that. But I somewhat say it correctly. I spent 28 years in California schools, and the whole reason I went into education was very much what you're talking about. You say it much more eloquently than I do, though. But it's about this idea of access and opportunity for youth. And really what was my linchpin in my trajectory of my life was when I was getting ready to graduate from UC Irvine. And I was sitting in my apartment, and this was in the early 90s, and the LA riots took place. And I sat there and I watched people looting. But what I saw them looting were what I consider basic necessities. So diapers, milk, toilet paper, and then a few VCRs. And I thought to myself, we live in the United States of America, and people should have access to these basic things. And they're walking into stores where they could take whatever they want, and they're taking basic necessities. Absolutely unacceptable. I have to be a part of changing that for future generations. And so education was the calling for me. What I didn't know at that time, and specifically for me, the children that I wanted to serve were children who English was not their first language, because I knew that language has nothing to do with intellect. And people tend to believe, unfortunately, that if you don't speak English, then you just can't be as smart as everybody else. And I had to dispel that, right? And so that was the my calling in terms of the group of children. Over time, I have grown in my I think my scale of who I want to reach, because I'm all about all means all. If you follow me on Twitter, you see I put that all the time, right? And because everybody has brilliance, and everybody has something to share, and some children get to share it a lot easier than others, and I want all to have that opportunity. But what I didn't know was that I was being prepared to run Worcester Public Schools. That I spent 28 years honing my skills and my knowledge and my ability to lead 3,000 miles away from where I grew up and where I learned all of this. But when I was approached to even consider applying by the search agent, when I looked at the demographics of the community, I fell in love right away. And I said, this is exactly the community that I have been looking for to lead. It was the exact size I was looking for, as the demographics. And I knew it was where I was supposed to be. And the school committee agreed with me at that time. The other piece that was going on in Worcester that I found fascinating and very exciting was the language that was used in the description of the job was the Renaissance in Worcester, and where Worcester was and where it was going. And I always like a challenge, and I wanted to be part of that, because I just have always, or I have felt since I earned my doctorate and really learned that education is not just about the schools, but it's about the whole community. And how exciting to be a part of a community that wants to be a part of that, instead of trying to build that. It already existed. So now it's a matter of bringing it all together.
Great, thank you. I'm old enough to have remembered having a T-shirt in the 1980s that said Worcester, the Paris of the 80s. So we're still working on that Renaissance.
My daughter told me that. Worcester's the Paris
yeah,
of the
I have one. I have one somewhere in the attic. So the next question I want to ask, I teach policy courses at Harvard. And what I say to my students at the beginning is, let's think for a moment about what's the problem we're trying to solve. What's the challenge before we start thinking of the solutions? The solutions have to be attached to a problem in the first place. We've just completed 3 decades of intense, expensive, time and labor consuming school reform on the theory that we could get to equity if we just optimize schools, if we fixed failing schools. And I was as much a believer in this and an advocate, and worked very hard in those vineyards for 3 decades. At the end of all that, however, even in Massachusetts, which has done extraordinarily well by comparison with other places, we still leave tens of thousands, arguably even hundreds of thousands of young people graduating from school unprepared for success in college and career. So I know that causes me, and I wonder how you think about it, to step back and say, okay, what's the problem we're looking at? And what's the role of schools and education in solving that problem? And what other things do we need to be thinking about so that people like your brother, Gisele, have a fair shot at achieving success? What do we need to, what's the challenge we need most to tackle?
Well, I think if we're honest about the problem we're solving, we are solving many of the reform efforts ideated on a foundation that's flawed. I mean, the foundation is that our system was never designed to do what we've layered on top of it, which is to make the American dream accessible to every child, right? And so if we hold that premise and we acknowledge that it is really good at sorting, tracking, suppressing, and if you are not in a very fine box that is almost inaccessible to probably every one of us in this room, there is something that would put us in a box of other. Then I think it opens the door for us to have a totally different kind of conversation. A conversation about what we hear uniformly from parents, particularly parents and polling data coming out of COVID. I want you to see my child. I want you to understand the needs of my child. I want the school and the system to deploy resources to my child when they need them in ways in which they are resident and can be accessible to me and my child. Our system is not designed to do that. It is largely a distribution platform for a very linear, finite box, right? So I think it calls us into resetting our funding formula. It calls us into really tapping into what do we know and understand from the science of learning and development about what every person, every human needs to thrive, and then how do we actually develop systems to understand the peculiarities of each one of us, right? And build capacity amongst a workforce and create the same kind of context for a workforce that is highly variable, right? To teach the whole child, right? And so that's why whole children require whole community solutions.
So, Rachel, I'm curious what you think then, with that sort of analysis, which is broader. I mean, after all, we know that students between kindergarten and grade 12 spend 20% of their waking hours in school. The remaining 80% is outside of school. And yet we have put on schools the expectation that you will solve for equity. And is that too big a request? In my own view, what we proved in the education reform area, that schools were necessary, but not sufficient to achieve equity. But I wonder, leading a school system, how you think about, the role of schools in solving the kind of problem that we've just been discussing.
So I think schools have a piece in it. I mean, we're preparing future generations, right? So when we think about it, moving and shifting really a mindset of how we see people and how we see individuals, we are a piece in this greater challenge of an equitable society. But to think that the schools or a school district can do it by ourselves, we're being very naive, and we're losing sight of why we were even why we exist, and we exist to ensure that children have the skills, dispositions, and the academic and cognitive skills to achieve whatever it is that they want to achieve.
Mhm.
So I don't believe that school districts or schools can do it by ourselves. I think that we've tried to take on much too much in schools, and because that's where the children are, right? And we are caregivers. That's why we go into this. We love children. And so we're always trying to fix it and fix it and fix it. But in the midst of that, then we have taken on too much. And there are experts that are out there that want to work with us. We just have to be willing to say, we don't have that answer. And someone come and help us, because this is an area of expertise that you can hone in on, you can spend more time on, and then we can work together to still get the positive outcomes that our children deserve.
Jen talked earlier about the ecosystem, and I wonder who else shares responsibility in preparing our young people for college and career success? Who ought to be at the table, and how do we organize that involvement in a meaningful way so we can attack issues which nobody's used the word yet, but poverty, for example, the issues associated with poverty that get in the way of young people coming to school in the first place, or being able to supply their best effort when they get there. So if as a community, we're going to take responsibility for those things, who needs to be at the table, and who shares responsibility, and how do we organize all that? Do you have any hunches on that?
Well, I would argue that every single person, every adult has a piece of the responsibility. Everybody. It's not it's somebody else's child. We are at a community. We need to be a village. It's all of our responsibility. Who needs to be at the table? The representatives who can commit the time to be a part of that. And we need to also do the outreach to others. So if you want me to get very, finite, of course it has to be our caregivers. Of course it has to be behavioral specialists. Of course it needs to be business community. It needs to be organizations such as WEC. It needs to be our university partners. It needs to be our future employers. I don't think that there's anybody that we can say that shouldn't be at the table. It's about then how we facilitate those conversations so that we actually get some outcomes, which takes me to the importance of authentically engaging with people, because it's not okay just to bring people to the table and say, here, we have this great idea. Don't you agree? And then and then we move on. No, authentic engagement means we've got a problem. Let's all come to the table. Let's talk through what that problem means. Let's come up with some solutions, because what I have in my head is not going to be the same thing that you have in your head. And only collectively can we best understand how to solve this problem. Not me, because I'm the superintendent with this fancy title, should I be going and telling a parent in my community how to solve the challenge that they may have with their child, or I want to flip it, how to elevate their child to be that brilliant scholar that we know that they can be. So I believe when I say collaboration, I was mentored by a superintendent that would say over and over again, you bring more people to the table than you think is possible to get outcomes. Don't limit that table, expand that table. You can get those outcomes. You just have to do that together. And so I believe in that.
Gisele, what role does philanthropy play in that, in particular, in fostering the kind of collaboration that would take the more holistic approach that we were talking about earlier?
I think philanthropy at its best is when it is creating will and demand for new things, and it is seeding new ground, right? So philanthropy can be the innovation arm before the bureaucracy decides to invest, right? It can be the infrastructure that says, we'll hold the party. We'll be the convener, right? Because when you extend an invitation through philanthropy, folks tend to come, right? It's creating new relationships well before you need to rely on them to advance a policy or advocate for a thing. Right? How do you actually stand on the balcony and say, who has a vested interest? Right? When we look at, and so I asked a series of questions about what does it mean to be a gateway community? What does it mean to be a resettlement community? Right? When the feds were banking on Worcester being a resettlement community, there was infrastructure that they identified here. In naming that infrastructure, there are some folks, some waves of, right, folks that have come into the community and that infrastructure held, and they have been able to thrive. And there are some that have not. What can we learn about who has been least well served by the infrastructure? I think philanthropy can ask the provocative question, can bring researchers to the table, can bring capacity, can bring eyes, right? I could make a really compelling argument that the 6 states of New England, so as the 6 states go, the country goes. That there are things happening in Worcester that the feds probably should have been paying attention to. And I'm guessing there's something about what it means to be a resettlement community that's a bit of a thorny wheel. And it's a sticky wick that if we interrogate it more deeply, I think there'll be a lot that we can learn. Philanthropy can elevate those things.
I want to return to the topic of leadership and ask a few questions that have to do with leading in these times. So one question is just how you manage the short-term demands of leadership, which you would know well in the school system. Your phone is ringing, your email box is full, you have all kinds of constituencies you have to satisfy and so forth. So managing for the short term, which is really a management thing, versus trying to put in place the sort of systemic redesign. When we think about, Gisele was talking about, the system's built for a set of outcomes that really don't serve the purpose of equity. And if you want to redesign for equity purposes, why we call my shop the Ed Redesign Lab, you have to think long-term. It has to be a long-term vision about what you're going to achieve. How do you balance those two sets of kind of goals that you have to manage well and at the same time envision a better future in a redesigned system? Why don't you start?
I personally, I think that way. It's just the way I am. So I'm always thinking multiple steps ahead about where I want things to go. And I don't allow the short-term fires, if you will, get in the way of the long-term. So I know where I need to go. And I know then I need to develop the strategy to get there. And so I kind of backward map it in my head. And I'm always in this data collection mode of how things are progressing towards that outcome down the road. So I'm talking with people, I'm watching to see what's happening. I'm listening a lot. I do a lot of just listening and trying to take things in and attaching it to where I believe things need to go. And then you have to be flexible and nimble. And I really learned that through COVID more than anything, right? So I was charged with reopening San Bernardino City Schools, which was a district of 72 schools, 50,000 children, and trying to figure out how do we reopen this district with hybrid and right, everything that was happening. And in that, I learned that I can have this great plan, and I did all the work that I needed to do, but I also had to be nimble and flexible and responsive, not reactive, responsive to what's going on. And so to me, that's that short term, something's just happened at a school, be responsive, address it, watch to see, are there systemic pieces that need to be worked on so that this doesn't repeat itself as we work towards a longer long-term plan. So it's this I think it's always this balance of being in, you mentioned the balcony. So being in at that balcony level to see, going down, taking care of what needs to happen with the team, building the team up so that they can be responsive also, so that I can stay more and more at the balcony level, and stay focused on the long term.
Great, thank you. Gisele, I mean, I'd be interested in your reflections on that. And also, you know, as you lead, what are the decision factors that you sift and sort through? I mean, from your own personal experience, from the people you talk to, from, you know, perceptions you have about policy and practice and research and all these influences as you make decisions at the foundation and elsewhere, just in terms of positions you'll take on issues. I wonder if you talk a little bit about that.
I think there's a fair amount of humility that needs to come to the forefront. I mean, I met you 15 years ago at the height of my, it was a bit of a vanity project. That a group of us thought that we could design schools for multi-system involved young people in New York City, young people that are in the donut hole, too young to drop out, not quite old enough to, right, be off someone's books, court involved, so juvenile or adult offenses, child welfare involved, cycling in and out of foster care, overage, underaccredited, that I could bring together the policy, I could bring together the research, right? And we could launch 2 schools to serve the population. And I think what I learned from that experience was what I knew as a youth development professional, which is young people, when given the opportunity, will vote with their feet. And to be mindful, are you designing with your ego and id in mind? Or have you asked the end user? Right, and so I think there is a calibration, particularly in philanthropy, that has to happen, which is to say, do I know? And have I asked those that are most intimately connected and impacted? And then once I've asked, have I actually leveraged my power to give them a seat at the table to help us understand? Because even if you ask folks a question, they're an expert in their experience, not all experiences, right? And so how do we sit in community looking at various data sets and trends? Who retains the right in that process? Who retains rights in solutions development? Who retains rights in auditing processes and impact? And so I think that humility to say, I've had some at-bats, I have tried, I have failed, and I now know what I don't know. And I'm better at asking questions. And I think then if I step all the way out of that, there are 4 things that I'm always trying to do in philanthropy. Ensure that there is strength of relationship across communities, right? So that you can actually see into what is the next thing, the next problem that folks need to solve for. Is there infrastructure? Are there ways of doing it? Do folks war out when there's new money on the table? Do they stand on the balcony and say, what does it take for every child? And then develop targeted universalist solutions and feel good about that, right? Who's furthest from opportunity? Are we talking about Black boys? Are we talking about LGBTQ youth? Are we talking about housing those that are homeless or housing insecure, right? How do we actually carve out the support that they need? And then resourcing, right? Resourcing, what's the will and demand that actually keeps us in lockstep?
Okay. The your comment about voting with their feet, I had the occasion to give some testimony to the Rhode Island legislature last week. And they were asking about various aspects of labor management relations and what's going on in the school system. And also that school system's been in receivership and whether or not they're going to move it out of receivership and so on and so forth. I said, well, if I were you, there's a red light flashing in the back of the room here. And I would be talking about the fact that Providence has a 50% chronic absentee rate right now. And if you look at that, examine that, talk to the people who aren't showing up at school, talk to the students who aren't showing up, that would be a needle that pulls a very long thread that would tell you a lot about what you need to think about in terms of reforming your schools, rather than starting with just the provisions of what the law lays out for, so on and so forth. That, again, it's a question of looking at the right problem. And I don't know what the numbers are here in Worcester, but chronic attendance problems are present virtually across the country right now. So I wonder, Rachel, again, it's sort of the same question I was asking Gisele, how you sift and sort the various influences on you and the problems that you have to deal with, which are myriad in the school system. Jen ticked off a number of them as we looked at. I just mentioned a prominent one. How do you go about setting your priorities and filter what you're going to put at the top of your list?
So it's not easy to filter, right? Because we're serving children, and so a parent's not really interested in hearing that, well, we're working on that, but it's kind of not at the top of the priority list, right? Like that's not a very sexy argument that can be made, and I wouldn't want to hear that about my daughter. But what you do is, so there are core principles of what strong teaching and learning looks like and sounds like in a classroom setting. We don't need to make that up. We know what that is. And so what we need to do is be making sure that our teachers and our principals are clear on what that looks like and sounds like in practice. And when it's not happening, what kind of conversations are we having in a respectful manner? Because these are people who, this is their career, this is their profession. I believe in my profession as an educator, 100, like I'm forever a classroom teacher, even though my title has changed. I believe that teachers go into the field because they love children, and they may make poor decisions at times. And not every single teacher is 100% like that every single day. But I do believe at the core that still exists. And so we don't have to keep making things up about what it needs to look like in the classroom setting. I was at a school today. I don't have to be in a classroom but 3 minutes to know this teacher's solid. And not just solid, this teacher knows how to work with any child that walks through that classroom. And how do I know that? Well, partly because I've been doing it for so long, but also because it's not a mystery. It's not a mystery. Teachers have to be clear about what they're teaching. They need to know what it looks like when the child is actually doing it. And then they need to be checking to make sure children are actually there with you. That means it's an active conversation in the classroom setting. And if English is not your first language and you are acquiring your content or your knowledge through English, then the teacher needs to add more visuals, right? Or the teacher needs to give more opportunity for children to speak with each other, because that's how language develops. So, so to the question of what do I need to prioritize, or how do I prioritize? I prioritize by looking at what is the experience of my students, my end users, right? And then those who work with them. So I'm out at schools a lot. I'm having conversations with children. Tomorrow, we're doing a shadow day. We're calling it High School Shadow Day. And we've got all of cabinet and high school principals shadowing high school students for half the day. So we can see, because we know that there's something with engagement. We know children aren't engaged right now at our middle school and high school setting. And we can make all kinds of reasons why, right? We were all in school, but we don't know what their daily experience is like. So we're going to go and we're going to learn what that is. And then from there, we'll come up with some possible themes, and then I'll take it back to the students again, because they're the ones we're working on educating, right? That is the priority. And everything else has to wrap around what the child needs. And that includes, you can't ignore the adults. So the adults are the vehicle. What terms you used earlier with me today?
Yes, that adults are mediators and moderators are all student experience and outcomes.
So the adult can be the moderator of something, or they can mediate when something's not going well, right? That's part of my job, to work with the team that I'm developing, and then they're developing those to get to that student, that child at the end. But ultimately, it has to be, the priority has to be about what does that child need? And if we don't know, then we need to go and find out by experiencing it with them.
Meet them where they are and give them what they need.
Sounds so simple, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, it does. It sounds simple, but it's also, you know, the other factor that I'd add to the list that you added is just this business of being a curator of opportunity for young people, of creating, you know, the first article I ever wrote about education was called Educating for Connectedness. The idea that our job as educators is to connect them with hope and possibility, and the sense that I have a place in the world, and it's worth my doing this schoolwork in order to get to that place, because that's motivating. And right now we're talking about the crisis in terms of learning and learning loss and so on and so forth, but ignoring the attendance issues that kids are alienated from the learning process. They're not being drawn back into school because of relationships, because our schools aren't designed for relationships. And they haven't, in many instances, been motivated by our curriculum and instruction. So we've got to figure out how do we build relationships on the one hand that make them feel like I have a relationship with you and I owe it to you to show up and try. And at the same time, what I'm doing in school describes a pathway to something that I can do that gives me a place to contribute in the world, which we all want. And I think that's a big job. All right, I'm going to shift gears again and ask you to help me solve a problem. So part of my job at Harvard is to train leaders to go on to head up school systems like yours and big school systems, nationally, state systems. Increasingly, it's difficult to persuade young people to go into this work because of the climate in our country right now. All these culture wars coming down to the level of local school boards and affecting the careers of superintendents. I'm part of a group actually that started in California with Carl Cohen, a famous California superintendent who along with Jen Cheatham, who's on our faculty from Madison, Wisconsin, started a group that's really concerned about superintendents being under siege. And a lot of my students who are mid-career, some of them in their, most of them in their 30s and 40s, and thinking about a career in school leadership, are now getting scared away. It's post-COVID, there are staff shortages, morale is low, there's high levels of attrition, and there's this sort of attack culture that you go into, which if you take the lead position, you're under fire. What do I say to them in order to get them to consider embracing the kind of opportunities that both of you in your own way, in your own careers have undertaken, but particularly Rachel in where you are right now?
So, I mean, you just have to be a little bit crazy. I mean, you do, right? You have to have a little bit of but you have to have a little bit of chutzpah, tenacity, right? About what that you want to be part of shifting this culture crazy that's going on right now. Like, you can be afraid of that, or you can lean into it because you're going to shift it to a different direction, right? And so that, I believe in the possibility of every child, and I believe in the possibility of every adult too, that cares about future generations. And so anybody who is, I believe the very fact that they are sitting in these graduate programs says that they have it in them. And you have to have that love of what can be, and to be willing to fall on your face, clean yourself back up, fall again, and be okay with that. because at the end of the day, it's about the future, right? And so, if not them, then who?
Mhm.
If not now, then when? I mean, ultimately, that's what it comes down to. So I guess I would say to them, it looks scary because you think you're going to do it by yourself. So, but you're not doing it by yourself.
Mhm.
And so you have, connecting them with a network that will support them and connecting them to why they went into education in the first place.
Mhm.
And now they get to have it on a broader scale of whatever that why was, but most likely it's they want this huge change for children. And things aren't going to get better until different kind of people are taking the leadership role. And when they are, and then others start to see that that you can be successful. I mean, I'm just going to call out an elephant in the room. We just had a change in our school committee, right? Like it's a big deal here in Worcester.
Mhm.
And it is quite frightening, but at the same time, the work has to continue for the children in this community. And so I've called on my mentors and I've called on people and I just have enough chutzpah that I'm just going to keep doing it. And that's what the others need to do too, right? Like, but they've got to have people that they can reach out to.
Mhm.
So I think it's that combination of be a little crazy, got to be that warrior and that champion for children, and then be okay with failing.
Mhm.
Not hold on to the superintendency or leadership position so hard that you give up who you are and why you do the work. Because when you do that, you've lost everything about your core person. And then how do you look at yourself in the mirror?
Great advice. So we appreciate the advice. And more importantly, we appreciate your stepping up to the leadership in
Thank
these
you.
times.
Okay.
Gisele, what do you think about that set of issues?
I am not the first person to call. I
Mhm.
think the Deborah Joel Fairwinds, you, Rachel, I think I take as my charge, spending more time with school board members, members of chambers of commerce, coalition and bridge builders,
Mhm.
because I think this is a moment where we have to stand up as balanced citizens committed to not just the each and every child, but to those furthest from opportunity. And in service of not only our democracy, but the next and subsequent generations to come through our communities, I think it's us. And
Mhm.
so I spend more time asking those folks, what's the coverage you're going to afford the superintendent?
Mhm.
Right?
So she asked me earlier today.
See, I would never say, but it is. It's the question is always, what's the coverage that you need?
Mhm.
Who else needs to be in this work with you? And do you have the friends to help bring them to the table? Because
Mhm.
that's not, if the superintendent spends the bulk of their time thinking about how to build will and demand, who has their eyes on the other stuff,
Mhm.
right? And so that those are the things that I think chambers can do, coalitions,
Mhm.
school board members, right? Your committee, that right?
Mhm.
What is the deep and abiding? So
I think, you mentioned the term friends, and I also think a lot of this is about relationships.
Mhm.
that's right.
I teach another course called Leading with the Board. And at the end of that, we meet a whole bunch of leaders in the education field, big city superintendents and state commissioners and so on and so forth, and school board members. And in the end, the executives that shine in that work are those that are capable of cultivating constructive relationships, even with people with whom they disagree.
That's right.
But to your point, Gisele, to be able to be out there in the community doing that kind of work entails that you've got a team getting the other day-to-day work done, because Your job is really, a big percentage having to do with relationships, relationships with the community, relationship with your authorizers, with the school board, who are there ostensibly because they care about children. And they do care about children, although many of us have different ideas about the how. How do we get it done? And but we can reasonably disagree and disagree agreeably
Yes.
on the how, if you built quality relationships. And that's I think the responsibility of both superintendents, board members, and other constituencies who interact. Unfortunately, that's not really our climate and culture right now, but it's up to us to lead and show the way in a different direction. Okay, just a time check here. I think we're at time for questions. So if anybody has questions and want to pass them to the end, I'm going to ask for a 1-minute response from each of our panelists to a simple question with a complex answer. And then if you have any questions, we'll try and get in a few questions before we have our featured speaker stand up and be with us tonight. So my last question is, what's a word of parting advice you'd have for the Worcester community in terms of setting its priority for children, youth, and families? And so that's part A. Part B is, what gives you hope? What gives you hope in this work? We're always talking about what keeps us up at night, but what enables you to go to sleep because there's an element of hope there that, maybe this really will work out.
The children I serve give me hope.
Mhm.
Every day. Every day I see them, I watch them, I listen to them. They are so incredibly tenacious, bright. They persevere. I mean, they bring so much light. They bring so much light. So they give me hope. And what was the other part? Because that's all I stuck on.
The other part
what
was-
do we need to do as a community, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Honestly,
You answer this question every week when you get up at a school board meeting, right?
pretty much,
Yeah.
we need to stay focused on the children. And are the decisions that we're making truly in their best interest? Are they in the best interest of the adults?
Gisele, how about you?
I think focusing on the North Star of education justice.
Mhm.
One, taking it as the responsibility of a system, of a state, of a community, the each and every. And the unapologetic focus on those that have been least well served. Right? So racial equity, asking the question, and what about our L's? Right? And what about the kids for whom this standard is inaccessible, this access, this opportunity is not there? What gives me hope? I was at Burncode High School. 100% graduation rate for the kids coming out of their dance program, their fine arts program, their music program. They serve the 2 largest housing complex. When you look at the poverty rates, when you look at the high needs rates, like, it is happening in your community. You can get every child through school, joyful, prepared for meaningful employment, for a life that they've chosen, right? Like, we don't have to go out of the community. It's happening right here. Despite a building that isn't keeping up with the demands of the program, like, despite all those things, it's happening right here. That gives me the hope.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Do we have questions, Jen?
We've talked about many things this evening, but one thing we have not talked about is education of our youngest learners. The early childhood work and kindergarten work. Could you all comment a little bit on that?
I think there's So, Paul, you foreshadowed complex response in a minute, right? There's a lot, particularly for kindergarten students that were born into or at the top of a pandemic, and the kind of early learning environments that they otherwise would have experienced, particularly for diverse learners that would have identified unique needs and provided resources and scaffolds at those pivotal moments, didn't necessarily happen. And so I think schools, districts around the country are in a position where they don't have the early childhood sped services that they need. And so I think this is an area where increasingly superintendents will be going back to the state, and states are trying to figure out, how do you respond when in this Common Core environment, the compounded impact of learning loss is most challenging. So I think we'll see through the schools of ed, more pressure, but more innovation and reliance on AI and different technologies. So I'm excited to see the way you all are using technologies, particularly as I went into classrooms serving kids with some pretty significant and acute needs. But the way you're innovating is really powerful.
So, I mean, there's no question that we know that early childhood is hugely important to having children reading at grade level at the end of third grade, and really just that whole school readiness piece. So COVID it's interesting because as you were speaking, I was flashing on the classrooms that I would sit in on when they were in virtual settings. And these, it's comical because it would be kindergarten, first grade students, and you're looking at them on the screen and they're rolling on the floor and they're, and the whole screen's going like this. You've got 25 heads doing everything. And you're thinking to yourself, well, I don't know how those children are learning at all. And God bless that teacher, right? But what I didn't think about are the 2 and 3 year olds that are at home that will then be our kindergarten students, right? Now, and first grade students, and the limited opportunities they had for that necessary socialization that's so incredibly important to the developmental process. So is there a lot of opportunity? Absolutely. What are we doing in Worcester Public Schools? Well, this year we are piloting what we're calling a Preppy K class. And we're doing it just at one of our elementary schools because we're just checking to see how this works, but kind of a 2-year kindergarten setting to see, but not maintain, like if the child is ready to go into first grade next year, great. But if not, we're giving them a little bit more time. And it's not a retention. It's very intentional about Preppy K, you get a two-year kinder experience if that's indeed what you need. So we're doing things like that, but it's going to take some time and partnerships.
I'm going to get an order in the water on this one, just to say, I think, there's still the bet on early childhood is the most highly leveraged investment you can make in education is the early years. That the under-attended space is really 0 to 3. We a lot of us are patting ourselves on the back for having done a pretty good job with 4 and 5 year olds, but really the 0 to 3 space is when the brain develops and when we're doing least. But the challenge overall still is to make the system universally accessible and universally high quality, but that it's a promising area because it's less controversial than some of the cultural wars we're having in the K-12 space. And that early childhood has always been better than K-12 on matters of personalization, on getting to know the students and their families and meeting them where they are and giving them what they need. So we have a lot to learn in K-12 from the practice of early childhood.
We also see, though, there is a space in that 0 to 3 where BIPOC parents, where ethnic minorities prioritize sending their children to community-rooted programming as opposed to schools, right? Because they want their children to emerge whole from it. And so I think there is also something to be learned about that, right? Like when given the choice, where do people send their 2-year-olds,
Mhm.
right? Why are they sending them there? What are they imagining about their own identity formation that will happen and will be a safe space? That they're not necessarily getting at scale in a K-12 environment.
That's a prime example of K-12 not taking on one, right? Like
Yep.
that's not our area of expertise, this
Yep.
0 to 3. And we pick it up for the special needs children at the 3 and beyond, but we shouldn't try to replicate, although we should try to learn from.
Yes.
And now I have two questions, actually, each of which could be its own forum. So crisp answers, folks. What structures at schools do we need to change to provide more fluid interaction with a community of experts that are available and willing to support change?
Well, I mean, for one thing, you have contracts that allow for very little planning and professional development time for teachers.
Mhm.
So making more room, I mean, we went into COVID and tried to convert to hybrid, and there was practically no time available to do the training necessary to make that massive conversion in the way we work. And so we lagged behind, and we've lagged behind on the use of technology forever anyway. So I think that kind of structure is one element you could change.
I think adaptive technologies, the ways in which AI programs with the university, dual credit enrollment, particularly for young people that are inclined to vote with their feet and say, school isn't for me. Where and how do we figure out who thrived in COVID and why, and provide those options for those children? And then I think the ways in which I saw Burncoat leveraging professional talent through contracts, vendors, micro-credentialing to bring those folks into schools as experts is really powerful.
I don't know if I have much more to add. I'll give some more thought, maybe ask the next question.
Okay, the next question could be on a whole series. Working with those who want to censor the curriculum and censor teacher voices. Censor the library, censor.
I'll step out into the choppy waters.
Okay.
When I look at Ipsos and other national parent polling, and it plays out the same way in New England. Parents are saying 4 things. I trust my child's teacher. So this question about trust and faith in the institution isn't pervasive in the way that I think the media reports it. I want schools to see my child. They are largely in favor, and this is across all lines of difference, including socioeconomic status, political ideology, a deep commitment to truth and history, right? And then this question, the 4th is a deep investment to get politics out of school. So parents say that when asked. How it plays out in community, I guess the question that I always ask is, are we creating a safe place for those that would stand up against what probably is a very vocal minority?
Yeah. I would say the same thing, and then it's about creating opportunities to actually listen to a variety of sides. I'm finding myself thinking more and more about this polarity in thinking that we seem to be at a place now where it's like it's always an or. It's this or it's that. And so I keep saying there's other conjunctions. There's one called like and, that we can find ways where we can come together to provide, get some common ground. And so helping people to not only see things through this or lens, but there's win-win for everybody.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And I'd like to thank our panel. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Gisele. Thank you, Lisa. Lots to think about. And now We have a special guest in our midst. John Bassett began his teaching career as an instructor at the University of Rochester, and things took off from there. John, like me, like Liz, is at heart an English teacher, but is also many other things, including president of Clark University and president of Heritage University in the state of Washington, which focuses on the needs of Native American students. I came to know John in 2009, 2010. John had convened a group of community members, and I will ask, some of them are here in the room, I'd ask them to either stand or wave, that original group of community members who were passionate about education and recognized that in order to have a strong system, we needed a group of people who would focus on and advocate for education. Out of those conversations, Worcester Education Collaborative was born. Although John is not in our community anymore, John is in Michigan, and John does not understand the meaning of retirement, but that's another issue. John is kept busy doing many, many things. John is also on my speed dial. And so for his professional achievements, his dedication to the ideals of higher education and K-12 education in all its forms, we recognize him by naming this event in his honor. And I now like to ask John to say a few words.
Oh my, after these three wonderful commentators here who are real agents of change, it would really be arrogant of me to address the same topics and pretend that I was really adding any wisdom for it. I'll make a couple of concluding comments afterwards. But first of all, Jen, I want to say, I'm very grateful for this and I'm honored. But the truth of the matter is, I was probably no more responsible for the mischief created 14 or 13 years ago than some of the other people here, like Mark Fuller, Patty Eppinger, George Tetler, Tom Delpreet, whole bunch of people. But I think it's because I left town, and so it was easy to pick on me that they decided they would name these things like this. No, I'm so proud of what the Worcester Education Collaborative has been doing. It's truly a national model. I hope it can get some attention so it can be a model for other communities. Worcester has been blessed in some very specific ways. We have family foundations here that make things possible in this community that aren't possible at a lot of places. We also had a very supportive business community that has continued to support the education of all the young people in this community because they knew their future employees were coming out of those educational systems. And so I think we've been fortunate that way. We're certainly fortunate with leadership now. It's grateful to have an opportunity to meet the new superintendent for the first time. I think there's an awful lot that has been learned today that I hope we can keep talking about, even though this meeting will be over. There's no question we start with the importance of teaching, which really, it's about learning, but I mean, it's the teaching we focus on, and having the best possible teachers in the classroom with leadership at the principal and superintendent level that's let those best teachers do what they do best and serve as a model for others. If anything, we need to work on recruiting more super people to do this and to have a feeling that they are agents of change. They are really the ones changing the community because that's where it's happening. The second thing is, if two of us both have great teachers, but one has a family supportive of that education and the other doesn't, it's still not going to come out equal. And I'm really pleased with this new initiative, what we're calling a family and community kind of project here, because working with families, particularly with the diversity of the families in this community, working with them so that they understand how important the education of their children is and the role they can play in that, how important that is. You know, if we tackle, as Paul says, if we tackle this absentee problem, it may not solve everything, but it's certainly a symptom and indicative of a problem we have. Do the students understand why their education is so important to their having a good future? So these are such important things. And, you know, the political environment we're talking about here at the end, it's hard to know what to do with that. Is this going to be a blip that'll finally get counteracted by people on the other side that say, no, we need this? Or is there something more deeply troubling there? Because these divisions are troubling not through our whole system, but worldwide. It's happening. So we need to keep our eye on that. We need to reach out to a broad variety of people. I did find that there is still maybe that 5% I can't communicate with, but in that 95%, there's a wide range of people's attitudes towards what we should be doing, and you can communicate with them. And if people feel they've been listened to, you've got a pretty good shot that you're going to have the majority of that community behind you there. So I'm just grateful to Jen for the job she's done ever since we agreed that this was what she ought to do with the rest of her career. By the way, Heritage isn't just Native American students. About 60% are Mexican-American farm families. So it is a minority, a first-generation, low-income thing with that kind of diversity. I appreciate being here. I love Worcester. Kay does too. She's sorry she's not here. Appreciate what Jen does. I really appreciate the comments you three have made, and I hope we can keep those and keep talking about them. Thanks again.
Yeah. Let me now introduce our board chair to make final remarks. Before I sit down, though, I do want to appreciate all of the folks in here. As I look across the room, I appreciate all of the work that you do, the extent to which you all lean in. I also want to note how many folks in this room when they're closing their correspondence, instead of saying yours truly or sincerely, say onward. So with that, onward. Kim.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Jen, and thank you, John. What an inspiring evening. My name is Kim Davenport, and as Jen said, I am the chair of the board for the Worcester Education Collaborative, and I'm honored to be here tonight, as well as to offer some thanks and some closing for our time together. First, I think another round of applause is definitely in order for our very talented Worcester Public School students from the Burncoat Arts Magnet Jazz Ensemble. Next, a very special thank you to John Bassett for your vision in helping to form WEC. Thank you. And for joining us tonight on the inaugural symposium. Come back next year, please. We're so pleased that you were able to make this trip. Leadership takes vision and courage, and I believe we learned a lot more about that from our extraordinary leaders this evening. So please join me again in thanking Rachel Monárrez, Gisele Shorter, and Paul Reville for your wisdom. I do want to make sure I thank the team behind the event who spent countless hours planning every detail. So Marcos and the team at the Nellie Mae Foundation, thank you for collaborating with the WEC staff to create a day where Gisele could see a slice of Worcester and have an amazing experience this evening. We couldn't do our work without you, and we appreciate that you came. We also want to thank the many individuals, foundations, and businesses that champion the work that WEC does. Your partnership really fuels our progress. Finally, I think it's safe to say that visionary leadership is also about being out front, sometimes well ahead of what is known to be true today. The journey takes time and sustained commitment. It also requires leadership that lifts and brings along a group, believing in us when we might falter in our own confidence. Tonight's conversation was renewing. I'm deeply hopeful for Worcester and our educational ecosystem. Hopeful, knowing that we have local leaders, guides, and partners in the work who will sustain and drive our relentless pursuit of excellence and equity in education for all of Worcester students. So on behalf of the board, I would like to thank you for spending your night with us and have safe travels home. Thank you.
But before we adjourn, I do want to thank my staff, the WEC staff, Julia Kilgore, Chris Aconi, and is Kyla here? Kyla Pacheco. If you all could stand and just thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everyone.